Okay, we are starting chapter 7, which is titled Human Climate Interactions, obviously over these MIS stages that we've been looking at. The book takes the approach of using the climate simulations we saw in the last chapter with UVic EMCS and try to relate the changes we saw in terms of precipitation, temperature, humidity, vegetation, desert areas, and so on, and relate to various papers that talk about archaeological evidences of various things like changes in tools, tool use, resource use, etc. And there are no figures, basically. There is one figure, and there are quite a few references. So what I've done is take the references from the book and several others from my own and provide context for the kind of processes of climate impact on the environment that likely impacted the hominin populations in terms of their movements, forced or otherwise. So let me just first go through the sections in the book so that you get a sense of what is being discussed in case you want to go back and read the whole chapter. Starts with an introduction and then talks about marine isotope stage 6, 150,000 to 135,000 years ago, which we have already seen in terms of simulations and known climate variability. Its impact on newly emerged modern humans. So already the idea is that climate affected modern humans in their behavior as well as movements, migrations. The last glacial cycle and the migration of modern humans out of Africa, so 135,000 years ago to essentially into the Holocene. Marine isotope stage 5e, which was colder, so Homo sapiens response to the warmer, local warming, as we will see again, to the Eemian interglacial. So you remember, we will see again, there is a cooling with peak cooling at 21,000 years ago, but within that we had many coolings and local warmings that we called stadials, interstadials, interglacials, Dansgaard, Ushger events, Heinrich events, and so on. All those are embedded in these stages that we are looking at. Marine isotope stage 5, the migration of modern humans out of Africa, again climate impact inferred. Marine isotope stage 5c, expanding deserts and coastal refugia. So as cold conditions set in and the entire global climate gets drier, colder, drier, sea level changes and coastal refugia evolve. So do the deserts force people to migrate far away, or do they become a barrier or bottlenecks for migration? And how the sea level changes create coastal refugia, and whether that forces different populations to be close to each other, interact, and how that would change behavior, communication, tools, cooperation, sharing, etc. Also has to be looked at. Marine isotope stage 5, coming closer to 90,000 years ago, changing conditions in a mild glacial interval. So we are having these ups and downs of changes in vegetation, temperature, sea level, and so on. Marine isotope stage 5, coming to 75,000 years ago, Homo sapiens respond to a changing global environment. So by then we have evidence, archaeological sites being explored, providing global indications of changes in climate, and of course we have used the model simulations with orbital forcing to look at how the global environment was changing and how Homo sapiens potentially responded to them. And embedded in this is a huge super volcano around 74,000 years ago, the Tobo on Sumatra, and I will have few slides specifically on that because it turns out that it had significant global impacts, and there is archaeological evidences pointing out that the hominins on the Indian subcontinent survived through this massive supervolcano as well. Marine isotope stage 4, coming down to 60,000 years ago, modern humans contend with expanding ice sheets and a polar desert. So when it gets really cold in the polar regions and gets heavily snowed and ice covered, then even the fish and marine resources and land megafauna, etc., vegetation, everything would disappear. So how that would have affected hominins who had adopted to this cold conditions, both genetically and behaviorally. So that's something we have to look at. The marine isotope stage 3 comes down to 30,000 years ago, where population expansion for Homo sapiens and extinctions for Neanderthals happened. So we have discussed Neanderthals a little bit, saying we don't know whether they went extinct or maybe got completely mixed up with the sapiens genetically and have left genetic imprints of various levels, percentages in different population groups, haplogroups. Marine isotope stage 2, 30,000 to 11,650 years ago, so the end of the last glacial. The last ice age and large-scale migrations and human behavioral change. So by this time, we are getting into the evolution of the modern human as we stand now, invention of agriculture and so on, starting right after this. There are debates about whether agriculture was not possible during the Pleistocene and these marine isotope stages because climate was too variable, and whether it was necessary in Holocene because of the extinction of megafauna and lack of resources for hunter-gatherers. So domestication of crops and so on became essential, and domestication of animals became essential as well. So that debate will go on, but the next chapter is more specifically focused on agriculture and humans, so we will revisit some of these, including details of the Holocene as well. Finally, this chapter covers the Holocene, 11,650 AD to 650 to AD 1800. Now these are referred to as Common Era, so before Common Era and Common Era. Population expansion and the rise of agriculture and domestication. So there are also issues of the population. It's one thing to say hominins were present, but can we say anything about the numbers, population densities, things like that? So there are many studies which have looked at that as well. So revisiting the climate part again, general curve of sea level change over the past 200,000 years showing likely impact on the visibility of marine resources. So when sea level changes, we will see that it creates certain dynamics of land interaction, and this would make marine resources visible in terms of the evidences at sites, shellfish remains, dyes derived from fish or shellfish marine resources, and so on. So these are the various sites here, and we can obviously see the local sea level changes at the Red Sea, Pacific, and the Pacific sea level is corrected here using various methods because over this glacial period starting 135,000 years ago, there are other evidences which allow us to correct the Pacific sea level. So you can see some adjustments here, but the point is that, as we said, there have been coolings, local warmings, and again recooling and glacials, interglacials, and depending on the time series you can get multiple time scales. This one is smoothed out, and the point to remember also is that global sea level as such may not have as much relevance as looking at how local sea levels and local refugia, coastal marine resources changed. So this shows rarely visible here in this period, partially visible, these are the periods where these changes happened. So this corresponds to rarely visible, partially visible, and fully visible. So if you go back in time here, there is marine resources partially visible at these archaeological sites, rarely visible here, partially and fully visible, partially visible, and again disappearing. So you can see the relation to cooling periods, warming periods, and so on. And in the Holocene, of course, after the end of the last glaciation, we have again fully visible use of marine resources by humans. Okay, so I will leave this introductory podcast here and come back again and look at various climate signals over these MIS stages into the Holocene, and look at various processes of creation of refugia and changes in various environmental conditions, and maybe typologies of how human interactions may happen with the environment and how that affects cultural evolution and so on. Of course, behavioral evolution, cooperation, tools, etc. Okay, there are some experiments now where people are put in isolated situations and allowed to create tools, and they argue that in general we have used tool evidences from the past from different archaeological sites to say they indicate social networks, communications, cooperations, sharing of technologies, and so on, whereas these experiments argue that humans have some intrinsic ability to invent similar tools in even when they are completely socially isolated. Obviously, this again raises the question about how to interpret past evidences of archaeological evidences of tools and so on, but I just want to mention it and not get into any more details about those arguments. Okay.